Hey, it's Sarah Burke here from the Women in Media podcast. And before we get started on a new episode, could I get you to hit like, follow, subscribe, hit the bell, whichever app you do your podcast listening in. Make sure you're all set up so you know when there's a new episode and you can help spread the word. Oh, and if you're so inclined, could I ask you to leave a review if the app that you're using does that? You're the best. All right, let's get to the show. I'm Sarah Burke, and this is the Women in Media podcast. My guest today is an award-winning musician who communicates her art through music and movement, pictures, and poetry. It's her storytelling that ties it all together.
I think it's my responsibility to talk about this because I'm a human being. This is everybody's problem. These are mass graves of children. This is genocide. This is not something that is an Indigenous person's problem or responsibility to solve. Like, that idea in itself is like, switch that immediately. If somebody can't see a mass grave of children and not need to know what their race is or their culture is, but just see that they're children, that's it. That's where it ends.
My guest today is iskwē, who you may know best for her music. Welcome to the Women in Media podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's not just about music for you. Like, you are always creating art in some way, shape, or form. You're always using your voice. Have you always been in the spotlight?
I think my mom would say yes.
Were you the kid in school who was like always talking?
Oh, definitely. And when I was young, back in the day when camcorders were like those big things that you had to like prop up on your shoulder, and these were like the at-home versions. My grandma had one, and there's tapes. There may or may not be tapes of me when I'm like 5 years old interviewing myself in the bathroom mirror.
I love that. Now, was the dream music, or was it something else?
The dream initially was dance. I always loved music, and I did want to be on stage, but for some reason, well, not for some reason, I just didn't have anybody to look up to in music that I was like, okay, they came from a similar place, so if they can do it, I can do it. Whereas growing up in Winnipeg, we had the Royal Winnipeg Ballet. So it was like a very, there was a place that you could go and you could train, and then you could progress and, be on stages and things like that. So that was my first dream.
Ballet was the beginning for me too.
Oh, was it?
Funny enough. Yeah. I used to take ballet and jazz and do all the competitive dancing. Yeah. So funny.
It was like, I danced like 5-6 days a week.
I imagine that your mom also hated doing your hair in a perfect bun.
Oh, she didn't do it. I did it.
Oh, good. My mom and I had so many fights about that. Oh my God. So from dancing, how did you make your way into music? When was that moment where you realized that you might also be able to do that?
Well, I mean, as a kid, I did sing. So I sang for the Winnipeg Girls Choir for a few years. I sang on a children's artist album, a Francophone album, when I was in elementary school. And then I became a teenager. And for me, like, my teenage years were quite moody. And so I stopped, right? Like, I really went for it. And I stopped singing for people, and I became very internal with it. So I would only sing when I was by myself. And I continued to sing, but I would only do it when I was by myself. And that's how it was for years and years and years, to the point that finally Canadian Idol came to Canada for the very first time. And I was working for a financial company in their call center. And my friend who sat in the cubicle beside me was like, oh, I'm going to go audition for Canadian Idol. And I'm like, I want to audition for Canadian Idol. And so I went home, and my partner at the time, who I had been living with for 2 years at this point, I was like, I want to audition for Canadian Idol. And he was like, do you know how to sing? Because I had never sung for him.
And your partner had to ask you that?
Yeah, my partner, who I had been living with for 2 years. And so I was like, well, I think so, So in Winnipeg, they're beautiful character apartments, which means very, very old, but still very lovely. And they're very long. So I had him stand in one part of the apartment, and I stood at the opposite end, and I belted out Alana Miles' Black Velvet.
That's amazing.
And he came in when I was done. He's like, all right, well, if this is what you want to do, then let's do it. And he was very business minded. So he's like, you have to sign up for some voice lessons, do a couple of recitals just to get, the feel of performing in front of people again, because you can't audition from another room. And, and then I did. I went to the audition. I made it through a couple of rounds. I got to the TV round, like where you go, all the judges are sitting there staring at you, so disinterested. And you sing, and there was just like so many cameras and so many lights. And they had kept us in this really cold holding pen. It was quite torturous, actually. And I picked a Whitney Houston tune, and I fully bombed. And I saw them kind of like, make faces when my voice cracked, and I finished the song. And then when I was done the song, I gave them a nice little nod, and I left the room. And then that was it. For the rest of my life, I've never stopped singing.
Right. And how did that turn into this wonderful solo career that you have?
Well, it took 20 years. So it took a lot of time and a lot of effort and energy and hard work and, tears and sweat. And I haven't bled for it, so that's good. But, it's a journey. It's not, it's nothing that I experienced quickly. Let's put it that way.
Is music right now the central part of your career, would you say?
Yes.
Or your favorite part?
I would say a hesitant yes. And I say hesitant only because I feel that my art is rooted in music, but it's also rooted in an amalgamation of different art mediums. So when I put on performances, or even when I'm writing songs, I really pull from visual elements, whether they are for still image, moving image, dance, these sorts of things, costuming. Like I'm really considering all of these pieces even as I'm writing the tunes. So for me, it's like once a song is written and it's going on to the album, I already know what the visual is going to be for it. I already know that narrative. So it all kind of it's all one big piece.
Do you feel like your career began from the songs that you were writing in music, or do you think that the visual elements led to the songs?
Well, I would say it was the music, because initially, so when I first got to the States, I had been in, obviously I'm from Canada. I'd gone from Winnipeg to Toronto. I lived in Toronto for about a year and a half, and then I pieced and went to New York and LA for about 6 years-ish. And when I was there, I worked on my first album. So I released the first album within a few months of moving back to Canada, but it was all very much written while I was in the US. Mm-hmm. And so the influences at that time, I was young. When I first got there, I was 25, I think. And I was by myself. I didn't know anybody. I was extremely vulnerable to external influences and thoughts and opinions and so on. So a lot of what I did was, and that album is a very strong reflection of that, of other people's ideas of what I should do. And I decided at the end of the day to continue with it, because I was like, you know what, because by the end of the album, there was more of me starting to come forward with it. But I had been pushing it for so long with, other people's, you should be an R&B singer, you should sing neo soul, you should do this, you should
trying to fit you into boxes. Yeah.
Putting me into boxes. And I was like, okay, I don't, what do I know? So it did start off, my career was quite active in that world. And then when I came back to Canada and I found the ability to pull from the visual art and the dance and movement again, then it continued on in a different channel. But so it was almost like there were two stages to the career for me. But the first one, the one that really put me in place, was not as visually related.
How much of your Indigenous heritage was present in the early days of your music?
I am Indigenous, so it's always going to be there. It's kind of like if you are a female and making music, how much of being a female is going to be a part of your music? Well, that would be sort of the simplest the simplistic answer. But if we're talking about specific references, whether it is, related to conversation or visible representation in terms of like art and so forth, then when I first started, no, those conversations weren't a part of what I was doing. Like I said, I was in the US and I was being very much directed by people that I was working with. And it wasn't there for me at that time, I guess. I was young. I was like, trying to figure things out.
Lyrically, is there a song you remember writing early on in your career or when you first got back to Canada where you really remember confronting any of your Indigenous heritage through song?
Absolutely. I have a song called Will I See? And this was the song that really launched my dedication to conversation around societal issues impacting Indigenous communities. And this song was written in response to the murder of Tina Fontaine, who was a young woman, a young Indigenous woman in Winnipeg. And this story really, for lack of better words, broke my heart and my spirit. And it wasn't because she was the first. It's definitely not because she was the last, and definitely because she wasn't the first. However, it was almost like the straw that broke the camel's back. Around that time, my sister was either pregnant or like my niece was just born or something like this. Like my dates have kind of escaped me, but it was, it was a really it just took me in a different way. And I remember in that moment, it was like, when your eyes open to something, you can't close them again. Yes. And it's not as though my eyes had been closed to what we were experiencing, but like I said, it was that straw that broke the camel's back. So that's what I'm referencing when I say that my eyes opened in a new way. And yeah, it absolutely changed my path because I couldn't imagine spending my energy talking about anything else anymore. It just was all of my heart went to supporting my community. Mm-hmm. All of my love went to supporting my community, my family, my loved ones, right? Like this isn't, these are stories that they're not other people's stories for us. These are our stories. These are the things that our loved ones are going through.
Tell me a little bit about your Indigenous background.
Well, I am Cree and Métis, and my family, so we are Métis of the Red River Valley, which is the birthplace of the Métis people. And my family has been there since the dawn of time. My mom's family, anyway. I don't know too much about my biological dad's family, but so I grew up with my mom and her culture and her family, and then my adopted dad's family. Being from Winnipeg, it's for me, it's funny whenever I encounter people who have either been to Winnipeg or are from Winnipeg. If it's a I've been to Winnipeg, it's a very different conversation. If it's an I'm from Winnipeg, people are either like they love it till the death, or they're like, I got out as fast as I could. And for me, I'm in the love it till to the death category. Like I don't know if it's something where it's that muscle memory, that DNA memory, but it's home. My family is all still there. My friends are all still there. Every time I'm there, I go back for big chunks of time. Every time I'm there, it's like a very different sensation than anywhere I've been. I've traveled lots. And I think a very large part of that has to do with the fact that, like I said, that's where my DNA comes from. And growing up in the community back home was beautiful and difficult and wonderful and all of these things, like any family, right? Yeah. Every family has all of those bits and pieces that teach you how to love, teach you how to protect yourself, teach you how to take care of yourself, teach you how to take care of others. Like I pulled all of those beautiful pieces from, being who I am and where I'm from.
How about siblings?
I have one sister, and she is 6 years younger than I am. She has just had her third child, so I am the proud auntie of 3 babies, and I love them all very, very much.
Nice.
And she's still in Winnipeg as well. She's a till death do us part kind.
Did you have any experiences growing up in Winnipeg where school was tough because of your Indigenous background, or for the most part, did you have a relatively normal upbringing?
Yeah, I mean, it was relatively normal. Like, I grew up in a neighborhood that was pretty diverse. So there was such a range of kids that when I was in elementary school, it was it was quite diverse. And so I didn't really notice. I'm also, like, in fairness, I am very white passing. So it's like my experiences as an Indigenous person in Winnipeg were dramatically different than a lot of my family members, right? But yeah, like in junior high and high school, it was substantially different though, where I found that the conversations, I found it hard being friends with a lot of people, because by the time I got to high school, it was extremely racist. And, there were so many people who, because when, we all come from different places when it's high school, you don't all come from the same neighborhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so by the time I got there were so many people that were new that didn't know what my background was and assumed I was white. So assumed that I thought like them, and would say really horrible things, and I would have to like pop up from the sidelines and be like, bing, hi guys, just so you know, you are actually talking about my family when you're saying these terrible, terrible things. And so it was quite alienating a lot of the time, but for a very different reason than somebody who is not white passing but Indigenous, because I can walk through those rooms, and if nobody knows me, they're not going to know what my background is. But then I'm also like, for me, I was constantly on defense mode, because I was constantly like, no, don't say that. That's shitty. Let me tell you why. This is where you're wrong. This is how you're racist. And I was doing that from, like 14 on.
It's quite the responsibility at that age. And I think about what what allies are starting to do now in, calling out behavior like that and correcting people in the ways that they speak. At 15, that's like a very different thing to take on.
It was in grade 8 when I first started when I remember it first starting. It was that year. At first it was confusing, because you're just like, what are you talking about? Right? Because like I said, I grew up with diversity. I grew up downtown Winnipeg, right? I grew up with all kinds of different kids, and my parents did a very good job at not, like, I didn't see it as any difference. I didn't see it as anything, like, to me, that was what was normal. You're taught that kind of ignorance. You don't start off that way. Kids don't look at their friend and are like, my friend is a different skin color, they suck. Like, they might notice that they look different, but it's not going to be a better or worse thing. Right? We teach them that. So yeah, like it came when it came, and then it just became the normal for me. Where I did like have those conversations all the time.
Yeah. I've asked many people over the last few weeks, like in interviews, whether it be for this podcast or just for work, there's lots of conversations right now where people are talking about if they learned about residential schools when they were growing up. And I remember learning about that stuff in school, and we always had like dedicated units to that. But I've been really surprised to find that a lot of people never even learned about it. What was that situation in Winnipeg? And I'm asking just out of genuine curiosity.
Yeah, I don't remember ever learning. I only remember knowing about it because of my family.
Through your family, not through the education system.
Yeah, I don't recall learning about it in school. I remember learning about like the buffalo jump and pemmican and, missionaries and Black Robe. Like, we were shown that film in school. Like, it was always the Jesuits. Like, that was the era that we got. We got first contact. Right? That's what we were taught about. And yeah, like I remember being in grade 9, and I had a teacher at my high school who was also Indigenous, and he took us to a pipe ceremony. And I was just like, right on, man. Like, it was awesome. And I was so stoked. My mom was so pumped. And then I remember seeing some of the kids and they were just being like such assholes about it, And I'm just like, ugh. But my teacher was so cool. Like, he was just, I don't know. I really admired this man. He was very, like, he didn't seem phased, but at the same time, he gave no space for the ones that were being jerks. Because we went to the ceremony somewhere else, right? So when we got there, the ones that were, quickly removed anybody that was acting up. But he didn't do it, like, he had no pain on his face that I could see. Right. And he and I, like, he knew I was Indigenous as well. So it was really nice to see that as a role model for me in how to respond when people are acting that way. Right. Because I don't know what his thoughts were on the inside. I don't know what his heart felt on the inside. But what he showed me was an understanding or a patience for somebody else's ignorance. That doesn't mean you accept it and ignore it, but it just means that you don't let it in.
You don't make it about you.
You don't make it about you. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And whether or not that's what he was doing, I don't know, but that's what I took from it, right? Like, when I watched him respond, he was just so calm and he was really kind. And yeah.
Is there anyone specific who made you want to get into music, Indigenous or otherwise?
Oh, shoot. Yeah. I mean, there are artists that I absolutely admire. Who are, like, global phenomenons. And, so artists like Erykah Badu, Kate Bush, David Bowie, Bjork, like, these are artists that I really admire. I admire their courage and their freedom in their art and, their ability to be themselves and speak their minds and, do all the things. Mm-hmm. More localized, it came much later on where I started to realize, like, wow, people have made careers, and careers don't necessarily mean fame and stardom and millions of dollars. And those, those were the artists like Kinney Starr that were extremely influential for me, because I was like, oh man, like, she's had a incredible career and is still, like, just a very normal person.
Yeah.
I mean that in the best way, right? Like, she's not normal, but she's like, her life is chill, is what I mean.
Yeah, she can still have, like, a good quality of life, like not living on a tour bus or.
Exactly.
Who has, like, mentored you in terms of your career as an artist?
Oh gosh, I've had so many. Well, Kinney was a big mentor for me. Absolutely. Nice. We've had, she's also a dear friend. But it did begin in the mentorship role, which was awesome. And awesome that she's so humble to start off in that position and then befriend, someone in the likes of me. But yeah, so she was a huge mentor for me. Somebody who's done a lot for me and for Indigenous music in general is Alan Greyeyes in Winnipeg. Mm-hmm. He's such a champion for our people and our voices and our music. And I think that I personally don't feel that there's any Indigenous musician in Canada that couldn't associate mass progress in their careers because of that man.
He is amazing. Yeah. In this day and age, what does it take for you to feel empowered as a musician, but also as a woman in the spotlight?
I've learned to, number one, turn off social media.
Yeah.
I was just like, that is not the place for me anymore. And that was probably the biggest place of empowerment for me, was just that disconnecting. And it's kind of like, when you're in an abusive relationship and you finally get out of it and you're like, it's really, really, really hard. And you go through this period of total devastation. And then you come out the other side and you're like, oh, I can breathe and I'm not afraid to breathe.
This is an assumption I'm making, but it sounds like part of that empowerment comes from not worrying about what others think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I haven't been one to worry about what others think in my lifetime, right? Like, I've always been the one that will put myself first in terms of be the one to stand up for somebody else and be the one to take the hit first. I've been a little bit almost like blind to that, where I will put myself in that position because I feel very passionate about the things that I'm passionate about. But then it was like, when it came to this, and that, the fear that develops, I'm like, this isn't me. Why am I so worried about this? This is not me, because the things how I conduct myself in my life is quite thought out. I'm an Aquarius. For those of you who don't know zodiac signs, maybe you don't care. Maybe you're really into it. I don't know. I'm into it. Aquarians are quite introspective. We spend a lot of time thinking about things and thinking about, like our interactions. And then, like when we're done with something, we go home and we think about it. Like we're just very, very much in our heads, and in our heads in the clouds.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like, how did this happen? How did I become this person that was like almost too invested in what somebody else was going to think about me? And I'm like, nope, not for me.
Okay. What are the other tools that go along with that for empowerment?
Age, I think is one. I recently turned 40, and when I was in Los Angeles, I can't tell you how many times people told me to lie about my age, pretend I was younger, never admit blah, 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 and all of those pieces. And I was just like, what? Like, no, thank you. So for me, age and like accepting age as it comes is very empowering. It's challenging, especially when you're like, oh gosh, where did all of these gray hairs come from? Or where did these wrinkles come from? Or whatever, right? Like, and I don't consider myself old, but just the fact that as you grow, you age, you change, you learn, you develop, all of those things. To me, it was like, all of it is beautiful. And I can't only get wiser.
Yeah.
There's other parts of aging as well. And so for me, accepting that and the comfort that I found in that was a very empowering position to take in my being and then in my art. Mm-hmm. I definitely feel far more liberated in my art this year than I have in any other year of my life. And all I can attribute it to is that acceptance of like, I hit this milestone and I'm cool with it. Mm-hmm. And that
being completely comfortable in your own skin. Yeah.
And then from there, it's like, and now I don't, and people can say what they want to say and like, whatever. And I'm just gonna, I'm gonna go forward in my life knowing that my heart is always in a good place and that I'm always concerned and thinking, but I also have to be true to myself. Mm-hmm. Just like everybody should.
Has there been a moment where you have had to push back or fight for your identity in artistic direction? What's a moment that you really persevered through that and came out in a place where you were so proud of yourself?
With my song Night Danger, I feel this was a song that I wrote. This is one where I had a total vision for the tune. To date, it's a song that I'm most proud of because it is such a reflection of me. And I had to fight for that song. Like so in every single way. I worked with a team and it was like all dudes, and so many times people wanted to change it and send it in a different direction or take credit for things they didn't do. But then also I had to really fight for it because it's a song where I say the F-bomb 500 times in it. And so it was like, well, this will never make it on the radio and this will never blah, 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 make it to playlists and da-da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like, I don't care. And yeah, so I really had to fight for that one. And, I feel so good about it because every time I hear it back, I'm like, man, that's a good song.
How comfortable has it been for you to use, your platforms to speak about those Indigenous conversations, to speak about, I know that you're participating in some Pride events, and I would love to hear a little more about that. But how easy is it for you to speak like as a two-spirited person?
Very easy. Yeah. For me, I was lucky enough to grow in a household that was very much in support of my being. My family was, I come from a family of artists and, strong women, and my grandfather was a huge influence in my life, and they were all very encouraging of me being me. So even though they'll tease me about, my mom has this thing, like if I didn't get my way, or the house that my parents live in is a bungalow, and the main floor, it's like the kitchen's in the back and the living room's in the front, and there's 2 hallways. It's kind of like a racetrack. And so my mom loves to tell this story about how if I wanted something and they said no, I would like go and do laps and like plan my attack to come back and reconvince them. And if they'd say no again, I'd go and do another lap. They thought it was hilarious, but it also it's a big part of my spirit now, right? Like that, developing that ability to plan out what I had to say, right? Because I didn't go in and just like whine. I would go in and, and be like, okay, here are the reasons why I think you should change your mind, right? Mm-hmm. And so because they were so gentle with me in that, I think that really nurtured my ability to be true to who I am and speak my mind about the things that I speak about. I also grew up in a family that, when I came out to my mom, she was like, because I was like nervous about it, right? So when I told her, I was just like, oh God, like I've got something to say and I feel kind of nervous. She's like, what is it? And then I told her and she's like, that's it? I'm like, what? And she's like, come on. And she really gave me a good lesson, because I was so caught up in myself, and maybe I had heard other people's stories that I forgot how much work other family members of mine had done in our family to create a space of safety for other types of people, right? Yeah. Like I've got cousins who are queer, I've got cousins who are trans, I've got cousins who are every shade of the rainbow. And so I went into it being like, and my mom's like, get over yourself. They already did all of the work for this family, right? So it was a good, humbling lesson for me. And so I think that was what I also brought forward, is that, my family, I have family members who did so much of that work so that I didn't have to. So for me, it's like, it's important to speak about things because, we place ourselves, we have this teaching of 7 generations where you are right in the middle of the generations before you and the generations that come after you. And you are a result of them, and you will be a part of the future, right? And that was what I had thought of when I was in that moment. It's like, of course, right? Like I have all of these generations of family members who have done all of this work, both when it comes to culture, when it comes to sexuality, gender, gender fluidity, all of these sections of being, that for me, it was like, now it's my job I don't have to fight that in my family, right? That's not my job. My job is to now be strong and present these conversations out in the world as a pillar of strength in it, knowing that my family has my back.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So a genuine question, because I don't know any better. What's the two-spirited story in Indigenous teachings? And is it the same across the board, or is it different in certain communities?
It's going to be different in different communities. I know that the term was coined in Winnipeg at a conference in 1990 something.
Okay.
Let me actually just Google that, because
that's so interesting that it was coined at a conference. Mm-hmm. That's not what I was expecting.
Held in Winnipeg in 1990. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So to Elder Myra Laramie, who proposed its use during the 3rd annual Intertribal Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian American Conference held in Winnipeg, 1990. The term is a translation of the Anishinaabemowin term, which I can't say, I don't speak this language, but which means two spirits.
When do you remember using that term, like two-spirited, for the first time?
Ooh, like outwardly?
Yeah.
When I was in my first like formal relationship with another two-spirit person. It was like I had romances with women. Funny for me, here's my story on this. I also did not, like, it took me a long time to understand myself in that, because again, I didn't have any references to people that were like me growing up. The women who were in relationships with women were all very physically identifiable in a way that I didn't identify with. And so for me, it was like, I don't get this. This isn't, like if that's a lesbian, quote unquote, that's not what I see in myself. I don't relate. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't until I moved to Los Angeles that I was like, oh, like women can be all kinds of different types of women and still be interested in women, or they can be, and that's actually when I started to understand and learn about the term two-spirit as well, right? Like, so, if it came into fruition in 1990, like became kind of stamped as a marker, I was 9. But for me, it came later on in life. Like and then in hindsight, I look back and I'm like, oh yes, like this friend of mine that I had at such and such age, I was like, oh no, I actually had like a massive crush on that person, but I didn't understand what it was. So nothing happened because I just, like you're a kid and you don't know or whatever. That was my journey in it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is a 2-part question.
All right, bring it. You're just getting all the goods on me today, Sarah. Holy.
It's not my fault. You're one of the most interesting people.
Just getting all loose-lipped on my water.
That's all you. What has been one of your proudest moments in regards to being two-spirited, whether it was someone who heard some of your music and really identified with like lyrical content, or something where you've publicly said something that someone's really identified with? Because there's a lot of difficult stories about this type of stuff, and I want to make sure we talk about like those moments we can celebrate too.
Yeah, absolutely. Oddly enough, my proudest moment was not my own. It was my younger cousin, and we were having a conversation one day, and I was already in a relationship with a two-spirited person, and I, was very comfortable. Like there was, I had no hesitation. There was, like I said, when I had that conversation with my mom, it really just launched me into this headspace of like, get over yourself. This isn't, like that's not your journey or your fight. And so I remember having a conversation with my younger cousin, who really because I was just like, I didn't really know how to identify this term doesn't fit, that term doesn't fit, like, because there's always sort of bits and pieces of it that I don't fully understand or don't fully relate to myself. And my cousin was like, well, I just love who I love.
Yeah.
And I went, oh, of course. And so for me, that was actually the most proud moment that I felt, and it wasn't mine. It was my cousin sharing that sentiment and me going like, here, of course, and learning it from the younger ones, right? Like the younger generations always have such vast amounts of knowledge, and you're just like, where does that come from?
Yeah. And it's almost like knowing that the younger cousin didn't have those same reservations that you did when you were first telling your mom.
Not at all.
That's beautiful.
Not at all. Yeah. And yeah, so for me, that was it. I don't know that, like I haven't really written too much about sexuality. So for me, that hasn't been a part of the conversations that I have in my music in general. And any time there's been conversation about sentiment, it usually is, like I have a song on my last album about a very dear friend of mine who passed away from cancer. So it's like, funny enough, in terms of this conversation, this album that I'm recording right now is very much the polar opposite. It is all about my personal experiences, my personal loves, my personal lusts, like all of that kind of stuff. So it is deeply, deeply personal and private, except for I'm putting it into an album that I will release to the world. But up until now, the conversations have generally been quite community focused, right? And focused on, something that is a little easier for me to step back from, right? Like it's always my heart in it, but when there's so many voices a part of the song, it's easier to hug everybody in it and be like, this is our story. This is us. I'm sharing like my interpretation of our story, or yeah.
Okay, now talk to me about one of your proudest songs in terms of showcasing your Indigenous identity.
So I wrote a song called Nobody Knows, and this song was, again, in response to missing and murdered Indigenous women on a big scale. So while Will I See was about that specific finding and that specific experience of, when they found Tina and Winnipeg came together, and it was very much my interpretation of her speaking back to us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something in that kind of space. Nobody Knows was a song that I wrote about. It was very angry and afraid. I was afraid for my niece. I was afraid for my family members, my loved ones, my friends, my community members, and I was angry. And I wrote that song from that place for all of us, right? For all of us, because we've all had that conversations with our mothers or our aunties of how to protect ourselves, how to walk differently across the street, how to know what's around us. Like when you walk into a room, I know where it's been ingrained into me. I know, like, this is going to be really dark, but like as a kid or as a teenager, I knew where, a beer bottle was at a party in case I needed it. Right. Like to at all times, like things like that. You're taught to know this, and it's dark and it's heavy, but this is our truth. Right. And so that song was very cathartic to sing because I was able to package all of that rage into one piece and scream it on stage. And I remember being at a festival. It was a Pride festival, ironically enough, in New Westminster, BC, just outside of Vancouver, or like a suburb of Vancouver. And there was this beautiful, strong Indigenous woman standing at the front of the stage. I'd never performed there before, so I was brand new, had like very small audience because I was new to the area. I was new to the scene, or newish to the scene, that kind of thing. But she came and stood directly in front of the stage when I played that song and sang with me every single word. And I was just like, fuck yeah. And that was just, by the end of it, I was crying because it was crying from like that's, not like sobbing, but like that place of like, ugh, why do we have to scream this?
Mm-hmm.
Exhaustion, right? Just like this is for us, this is for our loved ones, and we don't want to do that. I don't want to have to be on stage screaming about this stuff. I don't want to have to be having these conversations all the time. Nobody does.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I imagine that the last few weeks has been exhausting for you too. I think it was Donna Marrow, that conversation that we had. I think I saw that you joined us for that conversation. He said to me when we talked earlier that week, we were on the phone, and he said, I keep getting these calls, like, and it's hard not to feel like I'm being reached out to as like a token Indigenous person, even though I really want to help have the space to have these conversations. Did you find any of that over the last few weeks?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I just didn't respond to most of them. No, now's not the time.
Yeah. And for the most part, these are things that you've been thinking about your whole life, right?
Well, exactly. And to me, it's like, and this is the thing. It's like I had an interview earlier where I was talking about albums, music projects. And then, of course, the conversation ends up going there. And the, the question of whether I felt it was my responsibility as an Indigenous person and an artist to talk about it. And I'm like, no, I think it's my responsibility to talk about this because I'm a human being, right? Mm-hmm. Like this is everybody's problem. These are mass graves of children. This is genocide. This is not something that is an Indigenous person's problem or responsibility to solve. Like that idea in itself is like, switch that immediately. If somebody can't see a mass grave of children and not need to know what their race is or their culture is, but just see that they're children. That's it. That's where it ends. Right.
So simply put, but you're bang on. Yeah.
So that's how it is for me.
if you're in control of the conversation yourself and it's not dependent on anyone else or any interview, what are the ways that you want to uplift the Indigenous community with your art?
I just, I strive to be a good person every day. I strive to be better than I was yesterday every day. I strive to walk with love and talk with love, receive with love, give with love, and to be true to my art and to show others that those things are possible, right? We're not all the same. Like, people who are Indigenous are not all the same. We all have very different stories. And I find it can be tiring and difficult for the assumption to constantly be made that we all just, have this blanket understanding of each other, but we don't. Right? We're all very diverse. We have different languages. We have different cultures. We have different histories and stories. And, some families went to residential schools, some did not. Some families were torn apart during the 60s scoop, some were not. Some are, we have all of these different narratives, right? And so for me, it's what I hope is that I can just be myself and I can share my truth and I can be comfortable to share my truth and show people that that's okay. It's hard, but it's okay.
So because you also play on the other side of the microphone where you're the host.
Yeah.
This is very intriguing to me, because you're on both sides of it. At the beginning of the pandemic, I remember you were doing, I think it was like live in your living room or something like that on Instagram. And guess we're from over here, guess we're from over here. And, I loved that because it was unpredictable. You've also got this series with Ben Rayner, who I love, by the way, the Chesterfield.
Yeah.
Like when you turn the mic around and it's about asking someone else questions, what are the types of things that you want to know about others? And maybe sometimes it's like something you wish you were asked.
I really enjoy, this is one thing that I've discovered in myself when doing these hosting these series, is that I really enjoy humor. I'm actually really playful, and my family has a fantastic sense of humor. And, so I grew up with a very morbid sense of humor. But,
I feel like I picked that up.
Yeah, totally. Right. But I feel like I don't have enough time to be that person, or I haven't had enough time to be that person, because it's hard to be political and playful at the same time, right? People expect you to be, if you're political, they expect you to be serious all the time. And so I've really enjoyed being able to ask questions that are light in spirit and bring out laughter with people and share that space with people. It's really enjoyable for me. And I love seeing the way people who are watching respond. I love watching people's face when I throw something in and it catches them off guard, but in a fun way. And they're like, and then it's just like, it's a good time. And then to me, it really makes it feel like it opens up the conversation and it brings a sense of familiarity, fun, and you can go different places then.
It breaks down a barrier, really.
Yeah. And that's how I really enjoy being interviewed as well. Like, I love talking with you because I think there's such a, it's a conversation, number one. We do joke around, and it doesn't feel like, you ask a question, I answer, and then you're like, great, next question.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So for anybody who's, interviewing out there in the world, if you're like starting it up or, whatever, just, I can't encourage you enough to break that barrier down with humanity, humor, and, actual conversation rather than asking questions.
Get off book.
Get off book. Let it flow.
Yeah. Do you also have a drama background? Theater?
No, I don't.
You don't? Okay. I had to ask.
Yeah. Again, I'll quote my mother again. She always thought that I would be like in the theater or in movies or something like that. I was a very dramatic child. There's this one story. I'll tell you this story.
Okay.
When I was 2 years old, I was obsessed with Sleeping Beauty. Okay. And you know how Sleeping Beauty, once the prince kisses her, she comes back to life. Okay. So I would throw myself down onto the ground when I was 2 years old, and I would lay there until somebody would come and kiss me, and then I would get up. So one time when my auntie was visiting, I had like thrown myself down at the bottom of the stairs, and I just waited because I'm an Aquarius. We're very patient. And I just laid there waiting in character. And she came down the stairs and thought I was dead and thought that I had fallen down the stairs and was hysterical. And my mom came running out. She's like, what? And my auntie, because my auntie was like picking me up, she's like, she's dead. And my mom's like, no, she's not. And she gave me a kiss, and I just sprung back to life.
She just knew you were playing Sleeping Beauty.
There you have it.
Okay. Well, hey, great skills to have, to stay in character. I'm so intrigued and want to learn more about like Indigenous traditions and cultures. What's like a tradition from your family that, you wish that other people could learn about?
For me, it is the thing that I loved the most that I got from my mom was honoring the spirit of things. And so we have a custom where you put down tobacco. If you're going to take from the earth, you put down tobacco to say thanks, whether it is picking plants, whether it is hunting, whatever it might be, right? Like if you're going to receive something from this earth, you have to give thanks. And the way that we were taught was by putting tobacco down, you're honoring the spirit of whatever it is that you're receiving. And I think that for me, that's one that I'm a firm believer in. It really is a part of my everyday.
With how disrespectful people have been of the earth, this sounds like a tradition that's it helps you be aware of what you receive from the earth.
Exactly. And, I'm definitely not a perfect being. I am filled with imperfections, and I am filled with, what's the word? Not biases.
You're a hypocrite sometimes?
Exactly. Like there's no perfect being, but that teaching is still with me all the time. And I refer back to it. Right. So it's like, even so simple as, going out to pick medicine as an example, right? It's a nice thing to be able to say that you're connecting, this thing that's going to be healing your body, you're going to give thanks for it. I take it so far as if I'm ever cooking fish, or I'm not a big meat eater, so really it's going to be fish, but as I'm washing the fish before I cook it, in my mind or sometimes out loud, I'll just say thank you. And it's not because I'm like wanting to be cosmic or anything like this. It's literally because I'm grateful for the fact that I'm going to be eating this animal or this creature that was alive at one point. And I think it's important to recognize that life feeds life. Mm-hmm. There's so many cycles and evolutions and whatnot, and to pretend they don't exist is what is so dangerous for us and for our existence, because like,
it's led us to where we are now.
Yeah. Mother Earth is going to kick us off this planet before she dies.
Oh yeah.
Right?
So what's the best piece of advice that you've been given as an artist?
I was asked a question once, and I was asked if I wanted to be famous or if I wanted to have a career. And that has stuck with me forever. And it's a trick question, because it's like, you can have a career and be famous, or you could be famous, or you could have a career, there's all these different ways that you could put it together. And I've asked myself that question my entire career, and I'm not going to share the answer because I think it's a, constantly moving thing. But yeah, to me, that was the biggest piece of advice in the form of a question.
Wow. Mm-hmm. That is a really interesting one. Mm-hmm. In the spirit of having conversations on this podcast, important stories that need to be told, who are a couple women that you would suggest to come on?
Number one would be my very dear friend, Elena Vezentaris. She is a brilliant choreographer, originally from Toronto-ish, now in New York. She is the choreographer and the director of my music video Night Danger.
Okay.
We've also just done a photo shoot. She was the creative director for this photo shoot we've just done. She's outstanding. And she's just the most interesting artist. I love everything about this woman. So she would be number one. My second select would be my fantastic agent, Stephanie Purificati. She is, well, number one, she's a lady agent in an industry of very, very, very few lady agents. She works heavily in country music as well and is always battling for gender equality and so on. And she is a pit bull of an agent. Like, she is the person that you want to have on your team, but then is also the most hilarious, the funnest. She's like just this outstanding human, and I love her more than anything. So Elena, Stephanie, and number three, drum roll. You know what? I'm going to say Shoshona Kish. Shoshona is a beautiful songwriter and performer, and she has also recently started an event called the Indigenous Music Summit. And it is so, like, the amount of work that she has done for our community, the amount of work that she continues to do for Indigenous women, like, she is such a champion. And I think that her voice is one that people need to hear. She is brilliant. She is profound. She is stunning in terms of her being. You know, she's taught me a lot about speaking to people with kindness and with love. I've learned a lot of that from her. And so I think she would be a fantastic addition to your fantastic podcast.
Iskwē, was so nice talking to you. And thank you for being so kind and loving and open to have all of these discussions. I love the art that you make, and I love the space that you make to talk about it.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. And thank you for everything you do and having these conversations with us in such a place of kindness and openness. It really does make all the difference.
Thank you so much for being here for another episode of the Women in Media podcast, episode 10. We're still just getting started around here, and if you share the link to this episode on your favorite podcast service or leave me a review, every little bit helps. The idea here is to make sure the stories being told on this podcast have enough reach to inspire others. In case you missed the announcement, there will be a new episode every week this month. And up next, it's Kayla Gray of TSN, who just launched her new show, The Shift. I'm Sarah Burke, and thanks so much for listening.
A woman of ill repute is a person who's found success in non-traditional ways, often risking the disapproval of society. They're usually fearless, and more often than not, they're quite funny. They're certainly interesting, and sometimes inspirational. I'm Maureen Holloway, and along with my friend, noted broadcaster Wendy Mesley, we talk to these women on our podcast, and we call it Women of Ill Repute. You might like it. Lots of people do. And all you have to do is listen on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or you could go to our website at womenofillrepute.com. That's kind of our online home. And while you're there, it wouldn't hurt you to sign up for our newsletter. I'm just saying.
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.